Amy, welcome to the Mindship podcast. How are we doing?
Great. Delighted to be here.
Good. I'm so excited for this one. Um, but Amy, let's get straight in. So usually I ask my guests to come up with a summary, a log line of them. What would your summary be?
Well, I think it would be that I am a researcher and teacher of organizational learning. And I look at, in particular, the interpersonal dynamics in groups. And some of those groups are senior leader teams, and some of those groups are frontline teams. But I'm looking at the role of interpersonal interaction in effective teamwork and effective organizations.
Awesome, and we're going to needle into that soon for sure, which I'm excited about. But Amy, for maybe the people who live under a stone and have never come across you, maybe give us a bit of a whistle stop tour of I guess who you are and what it is you do.
So I'm a professor at Harvard at the business school in particular, and I'm an organizational psychologist. And I suppose I'm I've been doing organizational research for 30 years. Probably my best known work relates to psychological safety, that belief that you can speak up openly, especially with respect to the work itself, ideas, questions, concerns, and yes, even mistakes. And how that kind of climate really matters for, especially for knowledge work, but for any work in helping people learn and grow and perform well.
Awesome, and I guess I came across you, like you mentioned there, through psychological safety first and foremost. But I think is this the new book? Is this book 7? Is
I
that
think
right?
it's my seventh book.
Yeah.
It depends on how you count. I've got an edited volume. I'm not always sure about whether to count that one.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. Fair. Okay. That's good. That's good to know. I was like,
So
oh,
it's either seven or eight, but let's go with seven.
okay. Okay. Let's go with 7. Um, but I guess before we get into kind of all the great work you've done, I like to ask my guests to pick a number between 1 and 12. Um, and what this does is this gives me what I call a killer question, which I'll ask a little bit later on. So what number would you pick between 1 and 12?
I mean, just a random number.
A random number.
Eight.
8. Okay. So the question you've picked, which we'll come to a little bit later on, is do you like yourself? Okay. Um, but I guess, Amy, so you mentioned, kind of Harvard, you've got the book Psychological Safety. But before we go through all that, I want to ask you what's made you smile today?
that question.
Oh,
That
okay.
question made me smile today. But maybe a better answer is I just came off a conversation. It was a worldwide conversation. It happens monthly. That is on that it's focused on kindness in healthcare, and it's hard not to smile at some of the conversation. Um, these are preponderance of actual healthcare professionals, physicians, nurses, some administrators. Many of them are from the National Health Service in the UK, but not all. They're really from all over, from California to New Zealand, and me here in Boston. And I smile at the idea that kindness could be contagious.
Mm, nice, nice. Yeah, I mean, it could be contagious, and it should be, right? Like,
It
I
should
think
be.
it should
Yeah,
be. It should be.
yeah,
And then sometimes I think actually, it's one of them things what I think we're all inherently given. Kindness is a thing which we are given, but I think
right.
we make a choice, a bit like experimentation, a little bit later on, our curiosity, and we can either lean into it or lean away from it. And I think
Yes.
it's an interesting.
Sometimes it doesn't seem cool, right? Oh,
Mm,
it's cool to be like quippy and maybe even mean in at certain groups,
yeah.
but that's a mistake, clearly. Because and kindness doesn't mean being nice. Okay, let's be clear about that. Being nice is often code for don't say what you really think, and just take the kind of easier way out, and flatter people, but kindness in my mind and in this conversation is really about genuine human kindness, empathy, being helpful, um, sometimes tough love, right? Sometimes
Mm.
giving the difficult news, or um, telling people you expect more from them, and saying that with compassion and high expectations.
Yeah, yeah, you're so true. Like sometimes it's hard to be kind in them situations,
Yes,
and I guess that's when you look at stuff like candor, radical candor, and stuff like that. It's
yes.
some people really shy away from that.
Right, because it's hard. I mean, psychological safety and radical candor have a great deal in common. I mean, it really is. Radical candor is the behavior where psychological safety describes the climate in which you believe that's possible and expected. But make no mistake, it is not easy, right? I mean, it takes skill, it takes thoughtfulness. It's fundamentally a learning behavior. It's about learning your own, and supporting others' learning, and being willing to learn yourself.
Yeah. So, so I guess you mentioned with your kind of summary. You're a you mentioned researcher, teacher, but I want to take you all the way back to Amy as a child. What did you want to be when you grow up? When you was a child?
I didn't really have a clear plan. I didn't. I did not have an answer that I was hanging on to as a child for. I want to be this. I suppose if I ever did have an answer, or at those moments when I thought maybe I had an answer, it was teacher, to be a teacher. But I didn't know what that meant, or I didn't know any other category of teacher other than the category of teacher you have first in kindergarten, then first grade, and on from there. So I didn't know much about the category of college professor.
Okay. Okay. It it reminds me. So my background was in learning and development, but I found myself there by utter chance. I didn't even know that thing existed until I was
Right.
a grown up. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. I didn't know that the field of organizational behavior or organizational psychology existed as something that you could study and practice and actually get a job doing.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. Um, so okay, so that's kind of where we're going from, kind of a childhood. But I guess what's if I was to ask you, what's the first memory you have of getting into trouble? What comes to mind?
Oh boy. The first memory I have of getting into trouble, I believe, was in second grade, when I got into trouble, and it happened more than once. But the time that was very very scary and painful was I got into trouble, believe it or not, for reading under my desk. I know this sounds terrible, right? But here it gets better or worse depending on your point of view. I I was in a class that wasn't yet very good at reading. I'd been reading for a long time. It was just something that came so naturally to me. And I was bored in school, so I would read under the desk, and that was not allowed. It was a very strict place where you're supposed to do what you're supposed to do when you did it. And so the trouble came when the teacher then said I now needed to be sent to the principal. The principal's downstairs in a big scary office, and I was paralyzed. I just didn't think I could go there. I mean, I didn't see how physically I'd get myself out of my chair and down the stairs and into the principal's office. I remember it feeling like an impossibility. So the teacher appointed another student whose name, remember her name was Diane, to take me. And she literally had to pull me, and she pulled me down the stairs. And I remember hanging onto the banister, not wanting to be pulled down the stairs. And she was bigger and stronger than I was, and she took me all the way to the principal's office, and then just sat me there. And then the principal said, like, "What did you do?" And I was mute because I just couldn't. I couldn't find a way to answer it. I just was so scared I couldn't speak.
Wow. And is that just because of the? Do you think? I mean, obviously, it's easy to kind of reflect a little bit on now, but is that just the fact of, oh, this is a place I shouldn't be, and this feels fundamentally
Yeah, I mean,
unfair?
I knew I was bad. I mean, I knew I was bad. I was a bad girl. I'd done bad things, and I was terrified, I guess, of the punishment. I was terrified of the scary principal. Um, I just didn't want to be there. It's all I
Mm.
really remember. I was a little tiny thing.
It's fascinating how these moments, these fleeting moments, have such a big impact on us, and we can recall them just kind of within the blink of an eye. Um, okay, so going from your childhood right way through till today, okay, and I want you to picture the scene, dream sequence. You've got a treasure chest, and in that treasure chest, you can have one memory where you can tap into every day. What one memory would you use?
Gosh, that's a tough one. Um, I mean, I it seems like a memory would have to be quite worthy to go there.
Mm.
And I may be suffering right now from a recency bias, because now I'm getting blocked by a memory that only happened a couple of weeks ago. Um, but if that, how long? Who knows if it lasts the test of time? Um, I guess my the day of this is trite, but true still. Being at the front of being in the church and at the front, and the sort of the moment or the few moments of getting married are a pretty good memory, that I go back to. Um, and it seemed both in a way that it's very it's a time of love, but it's also a time of solemnity and real. It's sort of it's monumental to make a decision like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow. Can you remember the weather on that day?
oh yes, of course. Yeah, yeah. It was very hot and quite humid. So it was hot and sunny, which was nice. So it wasn't raining, and that makes it inconvenient for people. But it was also quite warm and humid,
Mm. I love thinking about
sticky.
how these experiences kind of how we can recall tastes and smells and
Yeah.
senses from the day. Um, okay, I want to take you. You've worked in the past with Buckminster Fuller, who's big. I think he's the owner of maybe three of my most favorite quotes.
Oh,
Yeah,
good.
yeah. But I know you was kind of lucky enough to work with Buckminster. Um, what was the biggest learning you gained from potentially interactions with Booker? I guess.
Yeah, Bucky. Yeah, everybody called him Bucky. I think the biggest learning, or the thing that stuck with me, that really had an impression on me, that has stuck with me, at least at the time, it was a surprise, was because Bucky was 85 when I started working for him. I was 21. He died just short of his 88th birthday. So it just tells you the his age, my age. And the thing that I remember being amazed by and powerfully influenced by was how much joy he had. Because I guess there are cultural messages everywhere, that, at least back then to me, that, old people are kind of, they're old. Maybe they're not as relevant. Maybe they aren't as happy. And I became quite aware that he was the most joyful person I'd ever known. And there he was, 4 times my age. So it's like, oh, well, that's interesting, right? That you can have joy, you can be joyful, and maybe even that I talked today about it, joyfully unencumbered, rather than all of the various stresses and anxieties, certainly that experienced in my 20s and before, as you've already
Mm.
heard, in second grade, and later, and and mid career later, all of the sort of the challenges of life that are not going to go away, that are ever present. And I'm not saying he didn't have challenges, but it was such a turnaround in my brain from a taken for granted assumption that you know young and healthy, that's where joy is, and then older, maybe not so much, when it was kind of
Mm.
almost in reverse.
It's fascinating. I came across Bucky. We was doing some work many years ago. I think it was this kind of it was more like a profiling, I guess, but it was called Tetramap, and they
It's
mentioned
called what?
it was called Tetramap.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Yes, and I came across him. And I remember I ended up going down a black hole to find out more about this Booker, and it was just a fascinating journey for me just to needle in and see. I guess at the very core, Bucky was an inventor, right? Like that's how
Yes.
I kind of see him anyway. Um, but yeah, it was fascinating. Okay, cool. So it would be absolutely shocking if I didn't have. It'd be very short-sighted of me if I didn't kind of have the author of a fearless organization on and ask him what is psychological safety and stuff like that. So I guess, Amy, I know I want to talk more around the new book, but just going back on kind of the fearless organization, if you had to define or explain what psychological safety is, how would you summarize it? I
I
guess.
would say it's a sense of felt permission for candor. Right? Not that candor's easy or that speaking up is easy or offering a dissenting view or asking for help when you're in over your head is easy. None of those things, I believe, are ever easy,
Mm.
but that you believe you have authorization, permission to do it, that it's part of the shared expectations for behavior, in your group. That's psychological safety. It's not being nice. It's not, um, you know, dialing it back a little on performance pressure or you know, feeling happy or comfortable. It's really about a sense. It's a learning environment.
Mm. I remember reading the Fearless Organization, and it allowed me. I guess the best way I can describe it, it allowed me. It added color to feeling. I guess is probably the best way to describe it because I remember thinking about some of the companies which I've worked in, some of the teams, and I can remember going, oh, that was kind of like the anxiety zone, and that was where
Yes.
I can remember that feeling and where I was comfortable, and actually this over here is like the learning, the bit where I was like, oh, this feels high performing, this feels safe, this feels like, and I remember it just kind of added a lot of structure, maybe a lot of
Hmm,
oh,
hmm.
now I understand it.
Yeah, I love that you said that because I do in the book. I identify four archetypes, four zones. The apathy zone where you quit and stay, the comfort zone where you're not particularly energized or stretched, but you feel comfortable. Then the anxiety zone where you're stretched and maybe even very much care about the work or what have you, but you don't feel like you can speak up if you need help, or you don't think you can point out a mistake of someone else's, etc. And then there's the learning zone. And the great thing about the learning zone is that you feel, you're more interested in the stuff you're doing than in how do I look? What do other people think of me right now? That's like just not front and center in your consciousness. It's more about almost like a flow state in
Mm.
the Csikszentmihalyi work, right? That you just are the challenge and the engagement are kind of in equal measure.
Yes, I love that. It's funny. So I've read I've read a lot of your books, and the one thing what comes across is like how they all compound one way or another onto each other, and that's just my perception of it. But it's like, oh wow, this goes with this. Like there's so much crossover and so much. I guess one leans on the other, and it's just a perfect blend. Um, but I guess the one question which kind of came to mind before we get onto kind of the new book is, what do you think is the one piece of the psychological safety that's often misunderstood?
Well, I would say I think the thing that's most often misunderstood is that psychological safety is about feeling comfortable and where you won't. It's often confused with the idea of a safe space, which is a different concept altogether, and it just shares that word safe. But safe space is a kind of trigger free space, a space where the promise to you is that you won't be uncomfortable and you won't um, be upset by something. So we're going to do our very best to kind of keep things within bounds. But psychological safety is really not that. Unfortunately, it's a sense of, if I make a mistake around here, it won't be held against me. If I need help, I can ask for it. It's more about learning. So that's been, I think that's been the most important misconception, and it's partly just the timing of, I think, both of these things being of interest in the last decade or so. But I like what you said about the book adding color, because in a way, I had done many, many academic papers on it, but the goal of the book, the job of the book was to add color, and you add color through stories. And so I think the job of the stories is to make you realize what it looks and feels like to be in a psychologically safe team or work environment in a more visceral way. And and probably, one of the stories that to me best illustrates that and is clearly the furthest from being comfortable that you can imagine is the story of Captain Sully Sullenberger and his co-pilot encountering Canadian geese that were completely ingested by and then broke the engines of the plane. And in those, basically 2.5 minutes that ensued, they had to team up to do something, nearly impossible, which was to land that plane safely somewhere where they wouldn't kill people on the ground and could hopefully keep everybody on that plane alive too. And it was the most remarkable feat of agility and teamwork, including with air traffic control. And that dynamic conversation, nothing could have been less comfortable, that you could possibly imagine. But it was candor, it was creativity, it was doing an absolute extraordinary job under very difficult situation.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, and I think sometimes you hear the word trust. Oh, psychological safety is trust. It's like no, it's part of it. It's not just trust though.
Right,
It's not
right.
it. Um, and I had a conversation recently with a friend, and I was kind of talking around these whole things of values and behaviors and stuff. And I was like, we're getting to a point where we're putting so many layers on top of something that we can't actually speak directly anymore. It feels like it's
Yes,
this towing the line.
yes.
And it's like, doesn't feel like a
That's
good place.
that's a nice segue, because one of the things that's beautiful about that transcript in the airplane is it's so direct, right? There's no, "Oh, let me try to explain." No, you just do it, right? You just sort of lean in. Now, that might not be appropriate language for all work environments, but to the extent to which we can just get into it without all of the hedging and tiptoeing, that's what I'm talking about. In fact, increasingly, I want to talk about high quality conversations. That what psychological safety is about is enabling. It's not the only thing that you need, but it is one of the important things you need to enable a high quality conversation where we're sharing ideas and evidence thoughtfully and directly, and in a way that is helping us both learn and move forward and make progress together.
So I love the kind of the whole we're making progress together. So many years ago, and it was many years ago, I went to university and I did crime scene investigation at university. And I always remember this thing the lecturer told me around how when two cars bump into each other, they make contracts and there's an exchange. Paint A of the car of vehicle A goes on to B and vice versa. And they both separate from that incident, but both fundamentally different now. They've both exchanged something in the term of, well, it'd be knowledge or color code or whatever. And I think for me, when I think about learning, that's it. It's that
I
kind of
love
exchange.
that. I
Yeah.
love that, right? That's exactly what a neat metaphor, because yes, we had this encounter and then we separate and we are different as a result. Now, maybe just a tiny bit different,
Mm.
but materially different.
Yeah. Okay. So before we get into the new book, I asked you a question to pick a question 1 to 12. You picked 8, and the question was, "Do you like yourself?" So, Amy, do you like yourself?
I don't know. I think I can I can go with no and yes, and but I think I'm gonna try to go with yes, because here's what makes me like myself is that I fundamentally, I can tell you what makes me not like myself too, but I fundamentally care about other people, and I try to do my best to do my part to help them. Individuals who approach me for something, or friends in my life, um, and I I think that other orientation is a very good trait, and the earnest desire to be a good person for others is very real and very present. Where the no can come from is on the same exact dimension. Like, despite those attributes, I don't always do everything I can. And there I can easily identify far too many moments where I've been selfish rather than generous.
Mm. There's a great analogy which my old boss used to say, which was the oxygen mask. When the
Right.
plane's going down, put your oxygen mask on first,
Yeah.
help others. I'm not sure where I sit with that, but I do like it in the fact of, you know, you can always find yourself giving, and like kind of like what you just alluded there,
Right.
you kind of take away from yourself, and there's a bit where you need to look after yourself or you need to do something for
Yeah.
you. It's a real interesting
Actually, that's
potential.
helpful. I think that's a helpful metaphor, because the one thing we can't change is the number of hours in the day, and ultimately the number of days in our life. And so you can end up being unhelpful and ineffective if you say yes to everything, for example, right? That just is one of those truisms that can still be a hard lesson to learn.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if anyone's ever mastered it either.
Yeah.
Um, okay, let's get on to your new book. So, I haven't completed the book yet. I am roughly just over halfway through, and I've got to say, I think it might be my favorite one yet. So, the book is it's dense with stories, but yeah, it's so accessible, and that's coming from someone. I'm dyslexic, so for me to say that,
Wow.
it's like, whew. But this could also be the fact that kind of, my the intersection of my world is in innovation, human centered design, employee experience, but I don't think it is. I think the book is quite special, and it's quite it's a real enjoyable read, and I'll probably needle on the stories a little bit later on. But I guess before I do, let's start around kind of the book. So the right kind of wrong, the science of failing well. Why did you write this book?
That's a good question. Well, I wrote it because, to my surprise, people seem to be still confused about failure, in 2023, whatever it is, right? Because there's a part of me that believes sincerely that everything in this book is obvious. And yet it's probably just obvious to me because I've been thinking about it for so long and studying it for so long. But I had enough evidence to believe that people, including, if not especially, executives, leaders of companies, were still sufficiently confused about failure that I could be helpful with by writing this book. And most certainly people in their lives as well, just ordinary people living their lives are confused about failure. So kind of job one was of the book for me was to articulate a compelling framework for types of failure, so that once and for all we could say, yep, here are the good kinds of failures that we must endeavor to have more of in our lives, because they help us learn and grow and make new discoveries. And here are the kinds of failures that we indeed should work hard to prevent, right? That seemed like a really good foundational understanding for people to have, whether they're leading companies or leading their lives.
Mm, mm. It's so I'm due to move on to my next gig later on this year. But I've just recently been working with a client, and it's fascinating when you talk about experimentation and failure, they go, "Ooh," it's like if you prickle a little bit, and it's like, well, I don't like that word failure. I'm like, how do you think some of the most innovative companies in the world have become the most innovative companies in the world? And it's, it's fascinating just to see how these companies, their reaction to the word failure and experimentation. I guess,
Yeah.
how have you found?
Exactly, exactly. It's very visceral, right? It's very, spontaneous that in fact, I've had people recently, because of course I've been out talking about it a little bit, and people say, "Well, you know, why don't you just not use the word failure? Like, language matters. You just call it something else." I say, "I get it. Like, I appreciate, and I believe words matter too. I appreciate the sentiment under that question. And yet, I say, I'm married to a scientist. And that's where experimentation is, of course, their bread and butter. And I promise you, when they run an experiment, they've done all the thinking, they've read the literature, they're pretty sure this is a good experiment to run. They hope they're right. And when the experiment, in fact, fails rather than succeeding, they know it's a failure, right? You can't just hide that under some other term, right? They're disappointed. I promise you, they're disappointed. And so I think it's more important to learn to be okay with the disappointment that brings, because of course it brings disappointment. You would have been further ahead had the experiment succeeded rather than failed. But in both cases, that result was new knowledge, right?
Mhm.
New, comma, valuable knowledge. And so they, in order to be successful as scientists, they learn to accept that, right? To be okay with not happy, but to be okay with the fact that failures are on the path towards success in their chosen field. And my point is only that the rest of us can get better at that too. Now,
Mm.
we don't have to fail as often as a leading scientist, but we still will fail, whether you're in an innovation department in a company or just a person, trying to make new friends.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think the word failure feel it shouldn't feel prickly, but it should be
Yeah.
clear. It should be clear that this is a failure. Like,
Yeah,
it's,
and that's okay. It's part
yeah,
of life,
yeah,
right? Yeah,
it's
and it's not, if we start calling everything with a happy term, then we'll have less joy, or less
yeah,
distinction, so then you don't have the joy of the success.
100%. But it's fascinating. So when I talk about experimentation with organizations, I have some Fight Club rules, some rules around what makes a good experiment, and I always think, Sam, your experimentation, there's a quick way to get used to experimenting. I think often experimentation starts with mindset and the setting what the organization operates in. And often I'm like, just make it simple to do so anyone can do it, make it adaptable and non additive, and make it easy to do when motivation's really low. Because then you'll get people to, it's not necessarily saying that's the best experiment, but it makes it easy for people to experiment with. But you talk a lot around the learner versus knower. And I'm wondering if you can maybe share a little bit about that, the kind of the mindset and the learner versus knower, I guess.
Yeah, and I talk about that because I think our natural state, not as children, especially little children, but our natural state as adults, especially as accomplished adults, is a state of knowing, and not just because of our expertise, but just if you find yourself, in the middle of a given day looking around, you will be under the impression that you see reality. Right? We rarely have this notion of, oh, I see reality filtered through my background biases, mood, etc. That's kind of influencing what my cognition and eyes are picking up and filtering out the rest. We just don't think about ourselves that way, as having, um, you know, limited views of reality rather than sort of somehow accurate holistic views of reality. And so, I talk about choosing learning, because the default state, I would say, is we've chosen knowing. But when you choose learning, you're forcing yourself to say, huh, yeah, I see a lot right now, but what am I missing? Like, I wonder what's around the corner. I wonder what aspect of this situation hasn't occurred to me, but might occur to someone else who comes from a different background or perspective than I have. So that habit, which is not easy but very powerful, that habit of curiosity, of I wonder what I wonder, right? Even just I wonder what I'm missing. I wonder where I'm wrong here.
Yeah. Do you think? So I like the analogy of oil and water; they don't mix. And when I think about how we should think about curiosity, like there's times when we need that logical thinker in, and there's times when we need to be expansive with that curiosity and that creativity of childlike, I guess.
Yes.
Um, and it's fascinating when I think about the kind of the know versus learn. Right, I do. When I was reading myself, I was kind of going, this is where I'm showing up as a knower, and actually I should be showing up
Ah,
as the learner. It's like
that's
how I show
good.
up.
No, you're right. It's context dependent. Right. So, in fact, let's say you go home today and you want to make some cookies, for your family. Like, you might as well show up as a knower. Get the recipe, follow it, follow it as precisely as you can, and
Mm,
put it in the oven for the right amount of time, and you'll get some good cookies as a result. Um, this isn't not necessarily a moment for I wonder. Like, I wonder what would happen if I used sugar instead of salt or salt instead of sugar. Like, no, not an I wonder moment.
yeah. I think, and I guess the reason why I think this is my favorite book. So there's so much crossover between the newest book and the book. So I wrote The Insightful Innovator, and it's so. I wish I waited to publish my book for this one to come out first, because oh my god, I was reading it, I was like, wow, oh wow, this could have made my own book so much better because I could have linked.
Wow,
So yeah, it's
that's the biggest compliment. Thank you.
but it was, and I was like, oh, it's anyway. But I guess the reason why I mentioned that is because I think one of my favorite chapters so far has been, I think it's chapter 5. I really enjoyed chapter 5, and for me, I think it's chapter 5. It's more. It feels like it's more around. It's focused on self awareness, I guess, and kind of
Yes.
there's throughout the book. There's so many great stories in there, and I guess two what really jumped out to me, or what I can recall recently, is there's one with Pepsi Clear. Is it? There's a
Yeah.
great story around Pepsi Clear, and then you
Yep.
mentioned Ray Dalio in there as well, and
Yes.
kind of this reframe. Um, but rather than me not do it justice at all, Amy, could you maybe talk about them 2 points again?
Sure, sure. It's funny because sometimes I'm asked, "What's your favorite failure story?" It's like, gosh, how do I choose among my children? But it might be that the Ray Dalio story is my favorite failure story.
Okay.
But so let me I'll back up. And first of all, if you're in chapter 5, you are more than halfway through, because it's 8 chapters, and the first 4 are longer than the second 4. Just so
Okay.
you know. Now, the I define intelligent failure, or AKA the right kind of wrong, as failures that happen in new territory in pursuit of a goal, driven by a hypothesis, and they're no bigger than necessary to get the new
Mm,
knowledge, right? And so the Crystal Pepsi story, which goes down as one of the worst product launch failures in commercial history, was it was there was a sort of a craze, a fad around clear sodas, like Seven Up and Sprite, rather than the colas. So Pepsi thought they'd get out there with a clear cola. It would taste like a cola, but it would be clear. And just to up the ante, because that's doable, it's all chemicals, but to up the ante, they'd also put it in a clear bottle, and it would be Pepsi Clear, and it would be a big hit. Well, the scientists in the company told the marketers in no uncertain terms that the problem with that idea is that the clear bottles actually let in too much light, and it ends up spoiling the soda,
mm,
so that it has a very short shelf life and starts to taste awful pretty quickly. But for whatever reason, that just wasn't the scientists' Go figure. They weren't listened to. And there was a hurry, to get it out there before whatever, competitive pressures. And it got out there. It was an embarrassing, expensive, reputationally problematic failure. It certainly doesn't qualify as intelligent because, although there was a goal, fine, check. It was new territory, of course, check. But they did have available knowledge to say this is not a good idea, and it wasn't heeded.
Mm.
So now let's fast forward to the Ray Dalio story, which actually it's similar time frame, but in 1982, Ray Dalio, who our listeners probably will recognize as a tremendously successful hedge entrepreneur and hedge fund CEO, who founded Bridgewater Associates, which has really been one of the most successful hedge funds in history, made lots and lots of money. Well, he had founded the company 7 years earlier. It's 1982. He was a very thoughtful student of economics and market dynamics, and he was convinced, based on a number of indicators, that the market and the U.S. economy was about to go into a tailspin. And he was aware that hypothesis was counter-normative, that most pundits were predicting something different. So, of course, that made it an attractive bet from a financial perspective. And so he bet literally everything he had and found himself without enough money to pay his rent, having to borrow money from his dad. Right. So, this is a guy with an MBA from Harvard, 7 years out of school, with this tremendous failure. So now let's take a look at that failure up against the criteria for right kind of wrong, intelligent failure. So yes, it was new territory. I mean, by definition, investing in the future, which is always investments, is unknown, new territory. It was in pursuit of a goal to make a ton of money. It was he had a thoughtful hypothesis. He had done his homework. He was very savvy about the sport he played. So far, so good. But here's where he violates the criteria, the four criteria. Criterion number 4 is that bet should be no bigger than necessary, right, to get the new information. And another way to put that when you're talking about financial investments is you should not bet more than you can afford to lose, right? So if you have this counter-normative prediction about the economy, maybe he could have bet a third of what he had, or whatever is the appropriate amount to still make a big upside, but not be in such bad shape when it turns out you are wrong. So, not a happy moment for Dalio, but then he says, in retrospect, that failure was the best thing that ever happened to me because it taught me to temper my confidence. One might even say arrogance, my confidence and my aggressiveness with a bit of humility. And he said, I learned to shift from, I know I'm right, to, I wonder why I'm right. Right, which is a small shift, right? Because he's not sort of saying, hey, what do I know? Right. I'm just Joe Schmo here, right? He's saying, I'm going to get curious, right? And it's a tiny shift from knowing to learning. Like, I wonder why I'm right. It's that next layer of doubt that allows you to then look at it critically again, to be actually proactively looking for the reasons you're wrong, not right. And if you do that exercise, earnestly, you will oftentimes discover what you've been missing and make a better bet.
Mhm.
If occasionally you can do that exercise and realize, no, I'm still pretty sure I'm right, then okay, fine, go for it.
Mm. It's fascinating for me when I think about kind of just experimentation in general. It's like your goal shouldn't be biased to it. It shouldn't be this is going to work. It should be the goal is learning. What am I going to learn from
Right,
this? It's
right.
like it doesn't matter whether it works, it doesn't work. Like, what do I learn from it? What will allow me to either spin up another few more experiments, which are more focused, or actually validate or disprove something really quickly. But there's a great, and I can't remember the term, it's a spectrum in the book, but you've got blameworthy to
Yes.
one side and is it praiseworthy, I think, to the
Yes,
other
it's a
side?
spectrum of causes, potential causes of failure.
Yeah, I guess could you just maybe give the
Sure.
listeners a bit of a whistle stop on that? Because I think when I was looking, I was like, ah, I was like, do I take a picture of this? I need to draw it out. It was brilliant. But yeah, go for it, Amy. Sorry.
Thank you. And again, just logical, right? It's just me sitting down with the pencil and saying, all right, let's think this through. Like, something goes wrong, in your life or in your organization. Let's stick with organization for a moment. Um, what might have caused it? Well, it might have been caused by someone deliberately making mischief, someone deliberately violating a rule and doing something wrong. And that, let's call that sabotage, right? That is, I think we would all agree, a blameworthy act,
Mm.
right? Now, it also could be, I'm just going to go sort of slowly to the right. It could be based on inattention. You just weren't paying attention. That might or might not be blameworthy, depending on the context. Maybe you didn't get enough sleep, or maybe you were asked to do something that's really, kind of too much for a human to do, um, too long a shift, what have you. Then, inability, you haven't been trained in that procedure yet, or the thing is simply too challenging to do consistently, or all the way over to the right where we get to a thoughtful experiment, right? And that, like every scientist every day, was really smart, really thoughtful, but alas, it was wrong and there was a failure. So as we've gone from the one side to the other, we've gone from obviously blameworthy to obviously praiseworthy. Now, the reason why I thought this thought experiment was worthy was that I ask people, I'll explain the spectrum, and then I ask people in companies, what percent of failures in your company do you think are caused by blameworthy acts? And they'll usually come back and say, well, not many, right? We don't have that many employees who are kind of waking up in the morning trying to do mischief and, harm the product or the customer. It's like, yeah, no, I kind of agree with you. And so they're giving me little tiny numbers, less than 1%. Right? And then I say, okay, how many failures in your organization get treated as if they were caused by blameworthy acts? And then there's either, a laughter or a groan, which is like all of them, or most of them. And then I say, yeah, that's the point, right? It's that gap between, and this is logic, right? It's the gap between the likely actual cause of the breakdown and our human or organizational response to it. And when that gap is out of whack, that it isn't really appropriate. It isn't appropriate to respond to people as if they've engaged in blameworthy acts when they haven't.
Mm.
Then we perpetuate the hiding, the not speaking up, all of the problematic behaviors that lead us to be more rather than less likely to encounter preventable failures.
It's fascinating to me when I talk about kind of failure or experimentation, and I often find myself. It feels like I'm having the same conversation with different clients and at different times in my career. Um, and sometimes it's a case of me going in and going, actually, use Google. You've got the kind of moonshot, and then you've got the effectiveness and efficiency. You've got kind of two businesses separated. But then I guess over time, my thought process has changed and gone, actually, no, you can be experimentation in effectiveness. You can everyday innovation and stuff like that. Um, and often I end up having to explain why experiments eat pilots for dinner and all this and the difference between it. But I guess thinking about my audience, so you've got either chief of innovation, chief of people, head of HRs. I guess thinking about if they're to pick this book up tomorrow, what stuff do you think they can take from the book and apply straight away?
So much. I mean, first of all, the the core of the book is, as I described before, the two, the sort of the good failures and the not so good failures. The core of the book is some best practices for thinking about and encouraging more experimentation, right? And that's so that you will have failures. When you have more experiments, you'll have more failures, but they'll be the good kind. They'll be the kind that drive you forward in your innovation aspirations as a company. And so even just, on page 64, the kind of summary table of the criteria for intelligent failure includes four sets of little questions you can ask yourself, or you can share that with your teams and have them just use that to kind of as a structured guide to engaging in better, higher quality experiments. Whether the formal kind in the lab are going to necessarily use those four criteria anyway. But what about in other roles that aren't, they don't think of themselves as having a formal job in a laboratory setting, but they still are positioned to engage in thoughtful forays into new territory. So I think that can be structured and shared with people. Then I share. It's not all it's certainly not even half my original research. Most of it isn't, but I share what I see as the accumulated best practices for preventing basic failures and preventing complex failures. The kind of the having a culture of psychological safety for speaking up, having blameless reporting for problems, so that we can catch and correct quickly. Um, um, Doing the kind of anticipatory experiments that help us see points of vulnerability before they lead to a major breakdown or fiasco, so that you're sort of deputizing people to be the learners of the organization and get out ahead of things. So I think it is a good repository for best practices for um, failure prevention of the bad kind, and also failure encouragement and enabling of the good kind. And then I do think that the second part of the book of self-awareness and situation awareness and system awareness are also useful competencies for any leadership development efforts.
Yes, and I can feel myself smiling. When I'm reading the book, I kind of, I think I think to myself, actually, you mentioned language earlier, but this is what this book does. It gives you a language to talk to other stakeholders or other people within the business and talk in the same language, which makes sense. And I think as I'm reading through the book, I'm like, this again gives the words to what you might be thinking, but you can't kind of put into
Right.
context. It's really helpful in that respect.
Yeah.
I was kind of I sent an email on my Get Noted newsletter last week talking about the process of book writing, and this is a last minute question. What came to mind as I was kind of doing some research. But when I did the book, I had mixed emotions. It was like, oh, figuring out which bits to keep in versus which bits to take out. And I've done one book. You've done 7/8 books. But I'm really intrigued. Kind of what
Mm.
what if anything? If I guess what if anything in any of your books would you change today?
Oh, well, this one, the new one, is probably too new to change to have much insight into that. Let me say first, though, that you're right. I mean, the most important question in a book is the question of what to leave out is just as important as the question of what to leave in. And I think sometimes people writing books don't think of it that way. They sort of think, oh my gosh, how am I going to write, 90,000 words or whatever it is? That sounds like a lot of words. Well, it's not that hard. You can just keep spewing words and they'll get there on the page. But there's two important ways you must answer the question of what to leave out, and one is the micro and the other is the macro. And on the micro is the excess wordiness, the excess words, the excess sentences that really don't need to be there to get a clean, clear explanation of what you're trying to say. So anytime I start writing something, it will first be overwritten. There just will be too many words there. And part of part of writing a book is being willing to do the hard and endless work of editing yourself, of putting it out there and saying, okay, I know that there's that beautiful paragraph is hiding in there somewhere, but it ain't there yet, right? So it's the sort of the tough job of just making it clean and clear, to say what you want, and no more, no less. And then on the macro, it's, for me, it's about there's a kind of almost infinite repertoire of stories that I could use, some from my own field research, some from published sources, newspapers and elsewhere. And and so the macro question becomes picking the best ones, right? The most compelling, but also they have to be a diverse set. You don't want every single story taking place at NASA, for example, but
Mhm.
it's not so bad to have one or two from NASA. Not all of them should be in fast moving consumer goods, but some should be, and some should be from. And this is my first book where I have stories, not as many, but probably a small percentage of the stories are stories from life. My life, other people's lives, like personal life stories, because this topic is so relevant for our personal lives. So it's and you never can be sure that there's a big question of selecting. What do you include, what do you exclude, and then you must be confident that you will never get it perfectly right.
Mm. Mm. I'll be taking that feedback on that advice for book 2 and 3 for sure. Right at the start of the show, Amy, I asked you what you want to be when you grow up. But as you know, we never stop growing, we never stop learning. So if I was to say to you now, Amy, what do you want to be now when you grow up?
I
What would your answer be now?
think I want to be a better version of myself, right? I want to be. I want to keep being an educator, to take and develop ideas that have um, implications and even power for action, right? Not just ideas for their own sake, however clearly expressed, but ideas with the potential to make a difference. First and foremost in organizations, because that's where my focus is and has been.
Mm. Nice. Amy, where can my listeners follow you? Where can they buy all of your books? Where can they buy into this one as well? Where can they kind of connect with you?
Well, I think the books can be bought wherever books are sold, whether you're corner bookstore or Amazon and all the rest. But this book, Right Kind of Wrong, was published simultaneously in the U.S. and the U.K. Two different publishers, same exact book, same pagination, no difference, so no worries. Um, Penguin in the U.K. and Simon and Schuster in the U.S. But you can follow me on what used to be called Twitter at Amy C. Edmondson, and LinkedIn at Amy C. Edmondson. I've recently crawled on to Instagram. I'm not sure I'm doing a very good job there yet. And at Harvard Business School, all faculty have faculty pages. That's a good place to go and look for a fuller list of my books and articles. And there's certainly a handful of digital articles that you can get to right away on Harvard Business Review and Fast Company and other outlets like that.
Awesome. Amy, thank you. You've been for me personally, you've been an absolute inspiration. Like your books have helped shape my thinking and my career. So yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for coming onto the show. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.